Chapter 3 in AP Environmental is going to start out talking about the nature of science, scientific method, and things of that sort. And it's going to end up talking about basic chemistry, things you'll need to know this term. So let's talk apes, shall we? The first thing is the nature of science, which of course is when scientists collect facts and data and then try to figure out what to do with all that stuff. We do form scientific hypothesis. You've probably heard of FIOC before, which is problem, hypothesis, observation, experiment, conclusion, which is an excellent model. But the key here is we need to find that problem first of all, and there's lots of problems, especially environmentally out there, such as global warming and pollution and overpopulation, lots of different things, pesticide use, GMOs are a huge concern right now. So plenty of room to do research and thought. Scientific process does include skepticism. In other words, do we really need to research it? Is there really a cure? Do we really need to go after this? Is it worth our time? Reproducibility, in other words, if one scientist figures something out, it needs to be able to reproduce in different environmental conditions. It needs to be done not only in a lab, but in the field, as an example. And it needs to be underneath peer review. Peer review is when other scientists from around the world actually look at it, test it to see if it's valid. Scientific journals like Nature are excellent to see that peer review. Scientific theory. Theory is oftentimes misused, that word. It must be something that's verifiable, believable, widely accepted. The most common theory is, of course, the theory of evolution. Has somebody actually seen over millions of years things change? Absolutely not, because we don't live millions of years. But the explanations are likely true. They're supported by evidence. We've got fossil evidence. We've got DNA evidence. We've got things like homology, analogy evidence for evolution. Most reliable knowledge, of course, is that we have about human nature and how it works is that theory. So again, a theory is based on facts, and it's the knowledge that we have about those facts. A scientific law is something that's indisputable. Events of nature that reoccur in the same way over and over again. Of course, the one that's on the screen there is the law of gravity. That's not going to change, thankfully. Scientific method, then, of course, there's really two ways of looking at it, or two groups. There's an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is one that has a variable changed. So that's the one where we're actually testing. The control group chosen variable is not changed. We use that as a standard to make sure that the experiment wouldn't change in the first place without manipulating. Multivariable analysis uses mathematical models to analyze interactions of many variables. A lot of times we can't just go out in nature and start experimenting. Things like disease. What we've done is actually modeled if something like the avian flu were to reach the United States. Computers have modeled how that would affect the United States, how it would spread, and of course the idea of that is how would we treat it afterwards. There's inductive versus deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning uses specific observations and measurements to arrive at a conclusion, kind of the favorite in the world of science because it's very detailed. There's also deductive reasoning, which uses logic to arrive at a specific conclusion based on a generalization or premise. Again, not quite as factual. Frontier science includes scientific results that have not been confirmed. 1940s and 50s when DNA research really started taking off, that was frontier. That was huge cutting edge, and of course we've just taken off from there now. Sound science, consensus science rather, scientific results that have been well tested and widely accepted. So it's very sound in that regard. And of course there's another one called junk science, when scientific results that have not been reviewed by peer results, or scientists rather. So if there's experiments going on out there in the real world and one scientist claims that it occurs, or we do an experiment in the lab and claims that it works or cures a disease or something like that, doesn't mean it's absolutely necessarily true. There's actually a person down in Chicago a couple years ago that claimed to have the cure for the AIDS virus, and what happened was he inoculated himself with the HIV virus, and unfortunately he's no longer with us. So that's kind of junk science. Nothing was really proven, unfortunately, for that scientist. Models and behaviors of systems. We have feedback loops. These are very important to AP environmental science. There's negative feedback loops where something stops. Global warming right now, scientists feel that if we stop producing the amount and releasing the amount of carbon into the atmosphere, global warming will stop. So that's kind of a negative feedback. Positive feedback is something that causes a system to do more of the same. An example of that in this class is if population continues to grow at a constant rate that it does, what's happening is we have to add more fertilizers and more pesticides to grow more food efficiently, and then what happens is we get contaminated groundwater, contaminated air, and ultimately more toxins in our body. So the effect just keeps going and going and going. Synergistic interaction, incredibly important again when we talk toxicity later down the road. Combined effects of a process being greater than the sum of separate effects. If somebody's on narcotics, for example, which is a powerful pain medication, they are advised by their doctor not to take alcohol in at the same time because they have a synergistic effect. Alone, they're going to have their own effects, but together, their combined effects is going to be very, very bad. We'll get some more examples of that when we get into pollution. Let's stop here and then we'll continue on with matter in part 2.